Today we're creating something truly special, a bedside table that's as unique as it is functional. It's a gift for my mom, made from an extraordinary material, naturally purple wood. The design is straightforward, featuring birch ply wood panels framed by ash rails and stiles. The real standout though is the purple heart, which will be showcased on the door and drawer front. This bedside table was a labour of love, taking me several months to complete. After planing the boards, I cut them to rough dimensions. These pieces are American ash and will form the frame. I don't have a jointer, but the rough edge of the board was straight enough to serve as a reference edge. Using my carefully calibrated tapping method, I moved the table saw fence just enough to trim off the rough edge. Once that was done, I flipped the boards to cut a parallel edge. Since I had just enough material for the frame, I had to work carefully. I split the board down the middle, marking each frame piece, along with the blade's curved thickness to minimize waste. I ran each piece through the table saw multiple times, gradually sneaking up on the exact dimensions I needed. The table saw left quite a bit of burn marks on the edges, which meant extra sanding. I realized too late that the burning wasn't due to the wood's density, but rather a dull blade. While I had the sander out, I also sanded the birch ply side panels, which I cut off camera. To simplify assembly, all the frame pieces will be glued. Traditional rail and style construction requires a floating panel to account for wood expansion and contraction, but since I'm using plywood, there's no need to worry about movement in this case. Once the glue is set, I need to trim the ends of the rails that extend past the panel. To do this, I attach an offcut to the workpiece using double-sided tape, allowing it to ride smoothly along the table saw fence. I find it much easier to trim the rails after glue up, rather than trying to get a perfect fit beforehand. That offcut getting pushed out by the blade was a warning of things to come. Next up are the legs, which need to be tapered. Before gluing them to the assembly, I cut the tapers using a tapering jig on the table saw. I'm careful not to stand directly behind the blade during these cuts, expecting the offcut to come flying at me. Sure enough, just as I turn off the saw, the blade spits it out. Unfortunately, I don't always learn my lesson the first time, so I attempt another cut without using a support piece to catch the offcut, with an even scarier result. Fortunately, there was no damage to either the blade or the saw. Before gluing the legs to the side assembly, I double-check the taper orientation. I've glued things in the wrong direction before. For cleaning up glue squeeze out, I use a drinking straw, which works well for getting into tight corners. As before, I trim the length of the legs after the glue up. With that done, I now have all the pieces needed to complete the frame assembly. To connect the cross rails to the legs, I'm using dowels for added strength in this end grain connection. I start by marking where to drill the corresponding holes for the dowels. Before moving forward, I did a dry assembly to ensure everything lines up perfectly. Once I confirmed the alignment, I marked the position of the center rail. Unfortunately, my measurements were slightly off, so the center rail isn't sitting in the correct position. To fix this, I'm shaving down the dowel slightly to allow for better alignment. Now it's time to start the glue up, and there's a lot that needs to come together. Remember how I mentioned my track record of gluing things in the wrong direction? The dowels really help with alignment, making the process much easier. Since the dowel for the centre rail is undersized, I took extra care to ensure that the rail sits flush with the legs. Once the glue is dried, I can measure for the drawer, leaving room for the backboard and drawer front. Placing the drawer slides and sides in the opening allows me to measure the correct width, leaving a small gap to prevent the drawer from sticking. I may have left a little too much space this time. I glued up the drawer off camera, leaving the bottom slightly oversized so I can trim it flush with the router. Now, onto the main attraction. I glued up the purple heart into one solid panel and am using my tapering jig to cut a clean straight edge. After drawing a cut line, I attach the jig with double-sided tape. It's surprisingly strong when used like this. Since the jig raises the panel above the table saw bed, I've placed an offcut on the side to support it while cutting. Removing the jig afterwards is quick and easy. Next, I separate the drawer front and the door from the panel. To attach the drawer front, I'll use the only card trick I know. I'm using concealed hinges, and a handy drilling guide makes it much easier to get the fit just right. Off camera, I glued up the ash top, and now I can get started on the finishing touches. The edges of the frame picked up a few dings while being moved around the workshop. To prevent more damage in the future and improve the overall feel, I gently break all the edges. I also break the corners at the bottom of the legs to prevent splitting if the table gets dragged across the floor. With all the parts prepped, it's time for the final sanding. But rather than bore you with that, here's my little helper soaking up some sun. Now onto the finish. I apply a coat of hard wax oil to the door and drawer front to enhance that beautiful rich colour of the purple heart. To preserve the light tones of the ash and birch ply, I use a water-based sealant. I switched to a cloth for the second and third coats since the roller was creating a lot of bubbles. Because water-based sealant raises the grain, I sand with 320 and 600 grit after the first coat, followed by 600 grit after the second and third coats for an ultra-smooth finish. Next comes the assembly. First up are the drawer slides, which need to be offset from the front to accommodate the drawer front. I never bother measuring for the height of the slides. Using an offcut makes it much easier. I use an offcut to raise the drawer, making it easier to attach the slides at the correct height. It turns out the gap I left to prevent the slides from sticking was way too big. To fill the gap, I'll install washers between the slides and drawer. I mark the screw position, superglue the washer in place and drive in the screw. Next, I attach the drawer front by positioning it with cards and securing it with 2 screws from inside the drawer. I double check that the frame is centered on the top before pre-drilling and driving in the screws. I made a door stop using a brass rod which I flattened on one side with a file. The door now closes with a satisfying clink. The final step is attaching the drawer and door pulls. And here is the final piece.